In a book that sold 7 million copies, Scott Peck famously said, "Life is difficult. This is a great truth, one of the greatest truths, because it is a great truth because once we truly see this truth, we transcend it. Once we truly know that life is difficult, once we truly understand and accept it, then life is no longer difficult." The Apostle Peter said, "Do not be surprised at the fiery ordeals that is coming on you." Jesus said, "In this world you will have trouble." In this series, we want to begin today. We want to talk about how life is difficult and how we can prepare for life being difficult. And one of the most important things you want to do as a teacher is to prepare your people for the difficult life that is coming. I was reminded of this last week. I spent this last week in Colorado. My 96-year-old dad had a 6-hour surgery, and the surgeon was optimistic, and all went well. But I tell you, it was a little bit nerve-wracking, as you can imagine. And spent one particular night, the night before the surgery, I would not describe myself particularly as a worrier. But I was up one night late, couldn't go to sleep, worried about my dad, and worried about not only the possibility of his dying, but also the possibility of him living in a great deal of pain. And I'm reminded again that life is difficult. And I want to do a little bit of teaching and a little bit of talking to you about teaching. And when you teach, your teaching ought to pour out of your life. And if there's a specific personal example that you can give, it always helps to communicate. And if the example is current, people want to sense that you have a relationship with the living God that is affecting you today. And people want to know, how is your relationship with God going these days? And how does your relationship with God help you to deal with life when life is difficult? And today we want to look at the question, why does suffering exist? And in order to answer this question, we're going to go back to the very beginning, and that is Genesis chapter 3, beginning in verse 16. To the woman, God said, "I will make pains in childbearing very severe," which I understand actually is a prophecy that came true. Can I get an amen? To the woman he said, "I will make pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." Now, this word desire is used 2 other times in the Old Testament. And one time it has to do with sexual, or we might say romantic desire. But probably that's not what it means here. More likely it has the meaning that it has in the next chapter, Genesis 4:7. This next word is used where it says, "If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door, and sin desires," same Hebrew word, sin desires to have you, but you must rule over it. And the idea of desire here appears to mean that woman, you're going to desire to rule over your husband. You're going to desire to be the boss of your husband, and it's not going to go well for you. And once again, I will say that prophecy is proved to be true. Truth be told, I think it's true of men and women, that we all want to desire to be the boss. I want to be the boss, and I want you to like it. I want you to do what I want, and I want you to like it. This explains relational conflict. We're going to look at a couple of different kinds of problems and suffering in this world, but this explains relational conflict, that we all want to be at the top of the ladder, and we all want to move to the top of the mountain, and it gets real crowded up there. And Jesus' solution, Jesus said, Matthew 20:25 and 26, Jesus called them together and said, you sense a sense of urgency about, he gathered them together, and he said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great must be your servant." And this is a solution. This is God's solution to many relational conflicts, that we all take on a kind of you first mindset, that I will be the servant and I will serve you, and I don't have to always get my way, and where would you like to go to dinner, and what would you like to do, and I'm going to pick up a broom and sweep the floor and so forth. And if we do this, if everybody does this, most relational conflicts will go away. And that is Jesus' plan. Now back to Genesis 3. To Adam, he said, "Because You listen to your wife. Why is there suffering in the world? Because men listen to their wives. Is that right? Well, actually, you look carefully at the context here. And what he's saying here is not that you listen to your wife in general, but that you listen to your wife when she was sinning and when she was leading you to sin. And that's the concept here. To Adam, he said, because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat fruit from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat your fruit until you return to the ground, since from it you are taken, for the dust you are, and dust you will return. And this explains vocational issues. This explains all the trouble we have in work. This explains why work is so much trouble. And I point out to you that work is not the result of the fall. Work is not God's punishment. You were made for work. Life goes better for you is if you embrace the calling that God has for you to do. Work is not a punishment. It is the weeds that are a punishment. The difficulty in work that are a punishment. So what does this passage teach about suffering? Why is there suffering in this world according to this passage? Well, the one-word answer is sin. The one-word answer is sin. Now, do you feel better? You feel like, because when suffering comes our way, that's the question we always want to ask. Why? Why is this happening to me? Well, I'll tell you why it's happening to you 9 times out of 10. Sin. It is sin in your own heart. It is sin in somebody else's heart. You sinned against somebody else and it caused conflict, or they sinned against you, or because of sin there is vocational issues. There's weeds in our work. That's the reason. Do you feel better? Now, my point is this. It doesn't make us feel better, and we don't really want to know why suffering. We think we do. When suffering comes, we think that knowing why will help. Knowing why will not help. We think that if we just understand why, that'll help. But what we really want is not the why of suffering. What we really want is the suffering to go away. And we're going to talk in this next passage, about how we can deal with suffering. So skip now to Romans 8, beginning in verse 18. I consider that our present suffering are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed to us. And this is a key verse that we're going to look at today. I consider that our present suffering are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed to us. And so he's picturing kind of a scale here. And it looks like our suffering is just overwhelming. It looks like it's just bigger than life. And he says, when you compare that suffering, no matter how big that suffering, when you put that suffering on one side of the scale and you put the glory that will be revealed to us on the other side of the scale, it makes things look different. And to illustrate this, and I'm going to read this now because I'm not sure exactly how much time I want to get to, and this is kind of a key idea. And this is a story that has blessed me and helped me my whole life, since my early 20s. And I would encourage you to read this story to your people often, once a year or more. And if I've read it to you, I make no apologies for reading it again. And we ought to be certain things that we as teachers ought to repeat over and over. This is from James Dobson's book, When God Doesn't Make Sense. But he talks about an incident that occurred during his son's early childhood that illustrates for me the profound love of the Heavenly Father and how we ought to think about the glory is to come. Ryan had a terrible ear infection when he was 3 years old and kept him and us awake most of the night. Shirley, James Dobson's wife, bundled up the little toddler the next morning and took him to see the pediatrician. The doctor was an older man with very little patience for squirming kids, and he wasn't overly fond of parents either. After examining Ryan, the doctor told Shirley that the infection had adhered itself to his eardrum and could not be treated by pulling the scab loose with a wicked little instrument. He warned us that this procedure would hurt, and he instructed Shirley to hold her son tightly on the table. Not only did this news alarm her, but enough of it was understood by Ryan to send him into orbit. It didn't take much to do that back in those days. Shirley did the best she could. She put Ryan on the examining table and attempted to hold him down, but he would have none of it. When the doctor inserted that pick-like instrument into his ear, the child broke loose and screamed to high heaven. The pediatrician then became very angry at Shirley and told her that if she couldn't follow instructions, she'd have to go and get her husband. I happened to be in the neighborhood and quickly came to the examining room. After hearing what was needed, I swallowed hard and wrapped my 200-pound, 6'2" frame around that toddler. It was one of the toughest moments in my career as a parent. What made it so emotional was the horizontal mirror that Ryan was facing on the back of the examining table. This made it possible for him to look directly at me as he screamed for mercy. Try to picture that scene in your mind. I really believe I was in greater agony that moment than was my terrified little boy. It was too much. I turned him loose. I got a beefed up version of the same bawling out that Shirley had received a few minutes earlier. Finally, however, the grouchy pediatrician and I finished the task. I reflected later on what I was feeling when I was going through so much suffering. What hurt me was that look on his face. Though he was screaming, I couldn't speak. He was talking to me with those big blue eyes. He was saying, "Daddy, Daddy, why are you doing this to me? I thought you loved me. I never thought you would do anything like this. How could you? Please stop hurting me." It was impossible for me to explain to Ryan that his suffering was necessary for his own good, that there was coming a greater glory, that there was coming a greater health. And just as Ryan, if magically he could think about the fact that this suffering was going to produce health for him, it was the way out. This suffering was the way out of the suffering. In a way, life would be better for him. In the same way, I believe God looks down from the balcony of heaven and says to you, if you will look forward to that coming glory, it will help you to deal with the suffering in the present day. Paul goes on to say, "For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth, right up to the present time." And this explains what insurance companies call acts of God. It explains earthquakes and so forth, because of our sin itself, the creation itself has been disrupted because of our sin. Verse 23, "Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for the adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we already have, what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently." But the key verse I want to look at is back in verse 18. "I consider that our present suffering are not worth comparing with the glory that is revealed to us." Now, one question you might deal with is, and that is, what did Paul know about suffering? What did Paul know about suffering? And in 2 Corinthians 11:23 and following, he says, "I worked much harder. I've been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent the night on the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from the Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at the sea, in danger from false teachers. I have labored and toiled. I have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches." And just by the way, the word he uses there is the same word he uses in Philippians 4:6, where he says, don't worry about anything. Don't be concerned about anything. And it reminds us that it's good to grasp the one and not let go of the other, because Paul said he himself is a little bit worried about the churches, as I was a little bit worried this last week about my daddy. And Paul says in another place, I know I've torn between the two. I desire to be depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. And so we see here that Paul knew a great deal about suffering. So why does suffering exist? Suffering exists because people are sinful. Why does suffering exist? Suffering exists because creation is affected. We got another verse that speaks to this. But the real question is, how do we cope with suffering? What do we do? What do we do when suffering comes? And what it tells us is that we long for home. I consider that our present suffering are not worth comparing. Put your suffering on one side of the scale and put on the other side of the scale the glory that will be revealed to us. And what we ought to think long and hard about is how glorious that glory will be. Colossians 3:1-2 says, since then I've been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your hearts on things above. Think about heaven, dwell on heaven, meditate on heaven, think about the glory that is to come. And when you suffer, think long and hard about the glory that is to come. Now, you might be tempted to think, well, if I do that, I'll be no earthly good. There's that old saying, people who think much about heaven are no earthly good, but it's not true. C.S. Lewis said, if you read history, you'll find that Christians who did the most for this present world were just the ones who thought the most about the next. It is since Christians have largely ceased to think of the other world that they have become so ineffective in this. Aim at heaven and you'll get earth thrown in. Aim at earth and you will get neither. How do we cope with suffering? We cope with suffering the same way the African slaves did back in the day. And I've got a video clip in your PowerPoint you might want to show your people. That's a trailer to that movie, 12 Years a Slave, and get your people in touch with just how difficult, of course, that suffering was. And how did those Christian African-American slaves deal with that? Well, they dealt with it the way Paul said to deal with it, and that is to think long and hard about heaven. They sang songs like, this world is not my home, I'm just passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. They sang another song that says, I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? Coming there to carry me home. A band of angels coming after me, coming for to carry me home. Another song they sang, were you there when they crucified my Lord? It goes on with that. And then the next verse, were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there when they pierced him from the side? And they talked about the idea, the song talks about the idea that Jesus knew much about suffering. Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Were you there when they raised him from the dead? Sometimes I feel like shouting, glory, 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 when I think about how God raised him from the dead, and he's going to raise us from the dead. And they got through their suffering by thinking about the glory that is to come. And one more song. I've got shoes, you got shoes, all God's children got shoes. When I get to heaven, I'm going to put on my shoes, going to walk all over God's heaven. Everybody's talking about heaven, ain't going there. Some of my masters talk about heaven, but they're not going to heaven. You will know them by their fruit, and by their fruit you will know them. Now, I can tell you by their fruit, I can tell you they're not going to heaven. Everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. We're going to walk all over God's heaven. And just encourage your people as they go through suffering that one of the things that we want to do is to think long and hard about the glory that is to come. And may God richly bless you as you teach these truths to your people this week.